So far this year, Israel has received $3.8 billion in military funding from the United States, then another $1 billion for its Iron Dome. However, Israel also gained something else as well. It was granted observer status by the African Union in July. Israel used to enjoy observer status at the now defunct Organization of African Unity, or OAU. But this was replaced by the current African Union in 2002. And ever since, Israel has been desperately trying for almost 20 years to get back in and obtain observer status. But what is Israel doing in the African Union? Why was it granted observer status, and what objectives is it trying to accomplish? Well, a team comprised of international lawyers have lodged a complaint in an attempt to get Israel's position at the African Union revoked. One of those lawyers is the one and only Stanley Cohen, who joins me now. Stanley is a Jewish-American lawyer and political activist who has had an extraordinary career. He's represented many high-profile defendants, such as Osama bin Laden's son-in-law, or Musa Abu Marzuk of Hamas. Stanley has also been a consultant to numerous NGOs, as well as to movements and governments throughout the Middle East, with Hamas and Hezbollah among them. Stanley, thank you so much for joining me. It is a pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to exchange with you. I'm a big fan. Your message, your show, your communication, your priorities are very important in a really troubled world right now.
Stanley, if we could perhaps start with the African Union. Why is Israel in the African Union? How did it get there? And how does it benefit exactly from having observer status?
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, look, it's obvious that Israel has had a very close connection to various despotic regimes in the African Union since literally day one. It's provided arms to the genocide in Rwanda. It's supported South Africa to the very end. They had a relationship involving resources for Israel's nuclear program in exchange for Israel helping to develop South Africa's. It's been involved in Kenya. It's been involved in Angola. It's been involved. You name it, Israel's footprint is heavy, is long, is deep in Africa, and as is typical for Israel, it's very ugly, it's very violent, it's very despotic, it's very corrupt. But it has tried for over 20 years to get the observer status, and it has failed on each occasion. And what it did this time, and it remains to be seen whether we will be able to flesh out in full how it accomplished it. It waited until the legislative body of the African Union was in suspension, was not meeting, was not sitting, and it brokered some sort of deal with the committee, the executive committee that deals with situations while they're not actively involved. Who knows? Bribery, weapons, resources, contracts, relationships. They reached out and they got it. Now, what does it get? It furthers the Israeli agenda of, like the Abraham Accords, of saying we're good people, we're liking to build, we want to build bridges and open doors. We're getting bad press. We're not the despotic, horrible, nightmare, genocidal maniacs the world correctly describes them as. It's got billions of dollars worth of weapons contracts in Africa. Its private, quote unquote, industry has billions of dollars worth of contracts for natural resources. The connectivity between the northern part of Africa, which is part of the Middle East, and the West and the East and the southern tier. What's most perverse about this process is it's a reintroduction, it's a reaffirmation, it's a reinflammation of the very the very white European colonial project that subjugated the African continent for 150 years. One that built the frontal organizations that control economic self-determination, that control politics, that control racial injustice, that built apartheid. So it's the same revisit to a continent which for 150 years was totally under the thumb of white European colonial projects. And to some degree, the French are still there, other countries are still there, they have a footprint there. But this provides Israel with an opportunity to work on its agenda, to work on its position and presence, to get access to information, to participate in discussions, to be able to introduce into the body politic at the commission or at the union their view, their discussion, their approach towards world problems, world issues. It allows them to build in a stronger safety net in the United Nations, whether it's in the General Assembly, where there can easily now be 12, 15 states from the African continent that can support it and be opposed to General Assembly votes against it. It builds in further support in the Security Council where it really doesn't need it. So on so many levels, this is a big win for Israel and a terrible loss for 1.4 billion members of the African continent.
You just mentioned some things that you also wrote about in Counterpunch. For example, Israel being able to garner support at the United Nations the next time it bombs Gaza. You also mentioned the extraction industrial complex, the arms sales. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more how Israel would gain in these domains from increasing ties with the African Union and African nations?
Sure. Israel is always looking to engender, to develop new support for cover. New states, especially states of color, especially states that traditionally one would think would be opposed because they have a history of genocide, of European colonial projects. So Israel is looking to develop this cheering section, this rubber stamp, this group, particularly in the African continent, a continent of people of color, Black women and men largely, certainly all of color, to support them. So that when the debate develops about Israeli racism, about its supremacist policies, about its hatred towards people of color, about its support for European colonial projects, about it being one, it gets to point to Africa. And it gets to say, what are you talking about? We've got the support of the African Union. When it comes down to key votes over whether a committee in the United Nations will go one way or another way in terms of potential sanctions, in terms of suspending Israel's rights or ability to continue in a particular committee, they can look to Africa. This is all part of the grand Israeli propaganda scheme. But yet, on the other hand, it also provides some cover for those African nations, individual African nations that have been getting political heat and flashback for the close economic relationship with Israel. So it furthers the ability of Israel to sell billions and more. We now know, recently it's been exposed that Israel has this enormous surveillance technology that it's been selling to African states and despotic regimes. We know it provides a launch pad to push back against South Africa and other historically independent states that have fought against the kind of apartheid, the kind of racism, the kind of hate, the kind of European colonial project that is Israel. So from a standpoint of propaganda, it's a win. From a standpoint of building in support for its economic, its military, and its political agenda, it's a win. And for the standpoint of garnering support from people of color, from a continent of color, the next time it knocks over schools, it destroys residential towers, it attacks hospitals in Gaza, it can look and say, what are you talking about? It's an extension. It's everything the Abraham Accords introduced but really couldn't produce. The fact that the AU, the fact that Bahrain, the fact that one day Saudi Arabia may be able to, or now Egypt, fly their airplanes directly to Tel Aviv is nothing compared to the ability of Israel to break bread with the African continent. And in violation of its history, in violation of, when you look at the constitutions of most, especially the large, not all, but most of the African states, when you look at their constitutions, they are built upon the antithesis of what Israel is. They speak in glaring, wonderful, broad, empowering terms of human rights, of social justice, of self-determination, of liberty, of racial and religious freedom from the tyranny of this controlled environment. You look at these constitutions, and then you see the African Union saying, we welcome you, at least the executive director of the African Union saying, come to us, we're friends. It's an outrage. And it's not so different than what I think you're seeing in Bahrain, where millions of people are saying, no, we don't support you. In Morocco, where the government is supporting Israel, but the people are opposed to it. In other places where the government is breaking bread with them, but the people are opposed to it. So it is this continued marriage of one despotic regime with other despotic regimes for mutual benefit for both.
So Stanley, you and a team of lawyers have gotten together. You're trying to revoke Israel's observer status at the African Union. Can you tell us a bit more about this work and how you plan on accomplishing this?
Sure, it's part of a broader strategy. You have the activity that's underway in the African Union itself, where there's some 24 states are now demanding a full discussion, debate, exchange when the African Union comes together again in another week, in less than a week. It is also part of challenges to Israel in various states in Africa under universal jurisdiction, where there are lawsuits for crimes against humanity and for war crimes, and where Israeli political leaders and military leaders can't travel lest they be possibly arrested or lest property be seized. Our strategy itself is to bring before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is an overseeing entity, an organization which was designed under the African Union and its predecessor to act as a referee, to act as a board of oversight, to deal with conflicts within the African Union, to provide a vehicle to challenge activities of one state versus another. For example, in 2014, I was part of a team of lawyers that brought an action in the African Union against Egypt for its refusal during the Israeli attack to open the Rafah border to let refugees under siege and under slaughter escape into Egypt. So it is an instrument that provides binding law, which serves as a mediator or conflict resolver, but it also provides advisory opinions. And at this point, we're seeking what amounts to an advisory opinion. We have two entities, one a national media, an international media outlet that's bottomed largely in the African continent, and two, we have a Palestinian solidarity organization in South Africa that are actually our clients. They're the complainants. They approached us and said, look, we have standing because we're recognized by the commission to bring an action that, among other things that we're now seeking, is one, discovery, which says, okay, we want the documents, we want the information, we want depositions, we want discussions, we want to interview, we want to question those people that played a role in this decision making so that the truth is fleshed out. We're seeking oral argument, and we're inviting Israel to participate in oral argument. They'll never do it. What Israel will say is, we can't do that because it's recognizing its jurisdiction. So we have affirmatively stated we will not argue later if you join an oral argument that you're ceding jurisdiction. So they can't use that as an excuse. We're seeking an interim stay, which in essence is the commission saying to the African Union, until this is resolved, until we take our position, until we render our verdict on this, we freeze Israel's observer status. They can't participate in any way. Ultimately, we're seeking an order, in essence, that says, no, this is not right. This human rights violator, this European colonial project, this system of apartheid cannot break bread with the African continent and should not be permitted. Now, there are other strategies underway. There's a lot of discussion. There's a petition drive underway. Dawn has brought a separate action directly in front of the African Union itself, which is seeking a revisit, but they're going to be revisiting this anyway in another week. So this is part of a collective strategy to put as much pressure, both political, both legal, both administratively, on Israel and those few individuals in the African Union that allowed this to happen. My understanding is we're now up to about 24 members of the African Union of the 54 or 55 states, which means we don't need that many more to reverse the decision legislatively, and I would hope that may happen. We're in communication with various states and organizations within the African Union itself about this. We are planning to submit a supplemental application for relief in the next week to 2 weeks. Now that we have more information about how this happened, who brought it about, and why, we're going to name particular individuals and seek depositions from them rather than generic requests. So it's part of a broad strategy. It involves, obviously, myself from the United States. It involves an attorney from Belgium who's also involved in the litigation at the ICC. It involves an attorney from Belfast, Ireland. It involves a number of South African lawyers, including one who's now stationed in Lebanon. It involves researchers from all over the world. So it really is a collective move by lawyers, by researchers, by activists to say, look, you can't in the face of, and by the way, we what we did in this submission is we have a dozen or so first party affidavits, complaints, declarations from victims of the most recent Israeli assault, the murder, the bombing, the destruction in Gaza just this past May. So our position is, in 2021, this is an obscenity. In 2021, when most of the world with open eyes and good heart looks at what's going on in Palestine and says, apartheid, 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 hatred, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. You cannot, as a continent that has withstood 150 years of even worse conduct, or not worse, but the same kind of European colonial violence, apartheid, hatred, resource theft. You cannot welcome Israel. You cannot give a privilege to a war criminal. That's the strategy.
Yeah, you mentioned there are 24 other nations on your side. I was actually going to ask you which countries have said they're against this, because if I'm not mistaken, I would assume there are a few parties who are perhaps a bit too afraid to say it.
Let's just say the obvious ones. You've got South Africa, you've got Zimbabwe, you've got Algeria, you've got some other countries on the west, on the western coast. I would just assume that they make their own representations and statements. There is a collective of southern tier African states and organization that's supporting it. This is a difficult call. It is a difficult call because much of Africa, although it's independent, is still in buried by economic debt. There are European colonial projects still with a footprint in Africa. There are civil wars going on. There's weapons trades going on. So it's a difficult issue, especially for some of the smaller countries that are trying to weather their own storm, are trying to engage in their own self-determination, to become involved, to become swept into an international issue of this magnitude. But as South Africa says, if not us, who? If the African Union will not stand up against a white supremacist European colonial project and say no, who will? And that's what it ultimately comes down to. Morocco, I suspect, is very disappointing. The Sudan has broken bread with Israel recently. It will be interesting to see how those who have broken bread with Israel, in the light of the history of its oppression, of its involvement, of its exploitation, of its interference. My God, it armed the genocide in Rwanda. It provided nuclear weapons, in essence, to South Africa during apartheid. It intervened in Angola. It has a bloody footprint in the history of the African continent. It has an ugly presence. And to say that it can put a suit on now and sit at the table, the nations of Africa, as a fellow traveler, as a brother or a sister state, is a distortion, is a perversity well beyond anything imaginable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you, Stanley, in Germany, for example, in 2019, the Bundestag issued a symbolic ruling, so it wasn't legally binding, just a symbolic one, calling boycott, divestment, sanctions anti-Semitic. This is a trend we're seeing now in the West. In one country after the next, they start condemning BDS as anti-Semitic, and then they outlaw organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, including the political wings. And I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about this trend? Because as of now in Germany, there are 3 people challenging this in court, a German, a Palestinian, and a Jew. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think of this trend in general? So not just in Germany, but worldwide.
Well, what I find paradoxical is the biggest move to silence association, to silence speech, to designate people as anti-Semitic or self-hating, to punish, to penalize movements, it is coming from states that profess to be democracies. It is coming from states that claim to be this fulcrum of enlightened thought, of diversity, of freedom, of the ability to exchange ideas and to grow and to welcome its diversity of thought. It's coming from that. Now, why? When you take a close look, you find many of them have their own fascists. I mean, the paradox of Germany stepping in and thinking that somehow by becoming a rubber stamp for Israel, it is going to reverse or undo its own history with Jews is perverse, to say the least. What's even more paradoxical when it comes to Germany is it is using today the very tactics it used against German Jews in the 30s, where it silenced speech, association, it closed newspapers, it stopped pamphleteers, it imprisoned people for daring to speak up and speak out. So Germany is doing today what it did in the 30s, and it believes because suddenly it's embracing very much a fellow traveler, a Zionist, that somehow it undoes its history, as perverse to say, in the extreme. But what's also interesting is, and I've said this for years, I have challenged the United States for half a century, whether it's domestic courts, international courts, in my writing, in my speaking, in my appearances. The two redeeming features of the United States that are not equal anywhere else in the world is, number one, is the First Amendment, association and speech. And number two is our diversity. And both are under tremendous attack right now, under tremendous attack by Zionists, under tremendous attack by despotic regimes, under tremendous attack by political players in the United States. What do people fear in the marketplace of ideas? The truth always rises. And I say this to Germans. I say this to people in Austria and Australia. I say this to people in France. I say this in the United Kingdom. If it's not true, if what the BDS movement is saying is what people are saying about Israel, if what people are saying about the United States, if what people are saying about your own country is false, it's not fact, it's not true, it'll rise in the marketplace of ideas. It is only in a robust marketplace of ideas where there is a free exchange of discussion, where there's debate, where there's challenge, where there's association. I litigated this. I was part of a team of lawyers that won this very issue in South Africa in 2013 and 14, radio station 786, where the South African Jewish Board of Directors, the vestige of a terrible Zionist organization that had very strong connections to apartheid, challenged radio station 786 because of two shows that it did. One that they claimed was a Holocaust denial show, and another one that attacked Israel. Now, South Africa has this very vibrant constitutional charter that talks about the First Amendment, that talks about association and speech, and that looks specifically at the United States First Amendment. I was brought in, I was part of the team, and we prevailed. Countries and movements and people that fear speech fear knowledge. They embrace ignorance. And for those who say, well, it's not always speech. Well, when speech becomes action, when it becomes speech brigaded in action, when it crosses the line into violence, when it crosses the line into real incantation with likelihood probability of events occurring, that's an exception in the United States, and it can occur anywhere else in the world. Open the door to association, open the door to speech. If the BDS movement is built of lies, the marketplace will establish it. If the so-called attack upon Israel is built of lies, the marketplace will expose it. On the other hand, what these countries fear is the movements are built of truth, and it will force them to have to take a principled and moral stand against by far the most despotic, damning, deadly, dangerous regime in the world today, Israel.
Yeah, that's very eloquently put. And adding to that, Professor David Miller, who was an academic at Bristol University, he just got fired for criticizing Israel. You know, there was a long smear campaign against him, just like there was a long smear campaign against the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. What do you think of the current state of academia and politics in the UK and the role that the Zionist lobby is playing in the UK specifically? Because I do feel it's stronger than in other places. I don't know if you'd agree with me in that assessment, though.
Well, I took a position with the former leader of Labour that he made a strategic blunder, and Labour made a strategic blunder not going into court. In not going into court, applying international law, applying standards of the European Court of Human Rights, applying protections of speech and challenging it. Get findings of fact, prove the case, put it out there in the public eye, because in the public eye, the facts, the truth always rises. I think it was a strategic blunder. I think the termination of Professor Miller is another situation where it's got to be pursued in court. It has to be challenged. There should be lawsuits. There should be demand that there be examination. Let expert witnesses get on the stand. Let them be cross-examined. Let facts be put into evidence. Let judges, many of whom closed their eyes like Goldstone did, in 2014, when he was asked to be one of the reviewers of what happened in Gaza, and issued a biting denunciation of Israel, only to be pushed back and intimidated later on. You would be surprised, not you, but you collectively, at the numbers of powerful people, smart people, academics, scholars, political leaders in the world that really, once you get beyond the rhetoric, have no idea of the nature and extent of Israeli crimes, what it's like to live in Palestine, what life and death is like, what apartheid there is like, what detention is like, what assassination is like, what land theft is like. Put those facts, that evidence. That's one of the things we really are very proud of in terms of our submission to the commission. We did a 200-page brief that detailed in specific with facts, with circumstances, with history. It can't be disputed what Israel does, to whom it does, how long it does it, how many ways it violates human rights and international law. Those are the kinds of facts that in the marketplace of idea in general, and in courtrooms in particular, can put the lie, can put to rest the hasbara, the rhetoric, the intimidation, the scandalous intervention of Zionist dogma into societies that claim to be free and robust communities. I find it interesting that when you go to the Trafalgar Square in London, and you walk around the walls and you see etched, carved into the walls of Trafalgar Square, this great tradition of lauding European colonial slaughter overseas, where they are applauding their own intervention, where they are memorializing a deep and dark and ugly history of the United Kingdom, and all of a sudden they're holier than thou and saying, oh my God, the BDS movement and speech and debating and raising issues that intimidate, that scare, that challenge people is a no-no. It is the penultimate hypocrisy. But I think the takeaway, both with the former leader of Labor and with Mr. Miller and in other cases, is you can't run from this. You can't hide from this. You can't try to massage this. You can't try to break bread and negotiate a resolution. It's not going to happen. You have to confront it. You have to challenge it. You have to get your experts. You have to introduce your facts. You have to put judges on the spot to take a look and say, okay, how do we explain away thousands of children being targeted and slaughtered? How do we take away electricity of 4 or 5 hours a day? How do we take away apartheid? How do we take away thousands of men, women, and children? There have been 800,000 political detainees that are Palestinian over the years. How do you take, you can't make it go away. Any attempt to negotiate with Zionists, any attempt to negotiate with front organizations for them, any attempt to accommodate the Israeli lobby in this naive belief that it'll be okay and it'll end up being fine is not just naive. It's playing into the hands of Zionism. It's playing into the hands of Israel. It's playing into the hands of the genocide and the war crimes directed against Palestinians every day for even longer than the 74 years that Israel was artificially hatched by the United Nations.
Yeah, speaking of these crimes, back in May, we had this onslaught against Gaza, 240 killed, 2,000 wounded. And then barely 2 months later, in July, you had these so-called progressives in Congress, like Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, Ayanna Pressley, voting to give Israel $3.8 billion in annual aid. And just recently, Congress gave Israel another $1 billion for its Iron Dome. Perhaps you saw that AOC switched her vote from no to present at the last minute. What do you think of all this? That progressives are funding Israel. What do you make of that?
Listen, people don't run for office in the United States to wage revolution from the chambers of Congress. You were really just basically talking about liberals. You're talking about young women and men. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, 50, 40, 30 years ago, was a young liberal. Ocasio-Cortez wants to be Nancy Pelosi one day. I mean, the notion that people rely upon, I mean, look, the Arms Export Control Act, there have been other legislative agendas that have been put out in public for years, permits Congress to move to freeze Israeli funding, to challenge the use of Israeli weapons for violation of international law. It's never been applied. It's never been used. if they were black, and if we weren't, if this was an African country, and if we didn't get natural resources from them, we would use it. So, it reminds me of the day when people running up and down the halls the time before last, where Bernie Sanders ran for office, and he used the word occupation. And young liberals seemed, he said occupation, And then it got daring enough where he talked about Palestinians must be treated with dignity and respect. And now he's turned around and said, fine, we're going to give them another $1 billion, but I want $1 billion for Gaza. Well, the problem with that is it sounds fine. The $1 billion doesn't go to Gaza. If it shows up at all, it goes to Israel. And Israel gets to control what happens to it. Israel can seize all of it or part of it for what it claims is tax arrears. It can control saying, oh, no, you can't allow antibiotics or you can't allow aspirin into Gaza because it'll keep people in good health. And if in their good health, one day they'll grow up to become terrorists. So this notion that the revolution is going to be waged, whether it's from Congress or from the White House, is silly. Saul Alinsky, the great social organizer years ago, said, the definition of a liberal is someone who stomps their foot down in righteous indignation in thin air. And that's what this particular group has done. When Ocasio-Cortez early on supported Palestinian self-determination and then got beat up, all of a sudden she comes out and she says, well, maybe I'm really not informed about this. I need to get some more information. I volunteered to teach her. I never heard back. And now she's taken the dramatic step of saying present. And has struggled to rationalize it away, what it means, what it doesn't mean. This is someone who represents one of the poorest, one of the brownest, one of the blackest, one of the most oppressed communities in the United States. And how does she vote? When it comes to arming, using money to fund white folks killing people of color in Palestine, present. So, look, I'm not saying that there isn't a role to play for the so-called squad or the progressives in the United States politically. Yes, but we have to be real. We can't be naive. What really works is staying in the street, putting pressure on, BDS, moving and suing and fighting, although ultimately the manner and means of the resistance on the ground in Palestine is an issue left solely to Palestinians. It's a battle I've had for decades now with certain progressive Americans and Westerners who, preach about lunch counter sit-ins and say, oh, it should go this way. Oh, it should go that way. I don't support BDS for this reason or that reason. They seek to insinuate themselves into the most intimate details of how Palestinians choose to fight back, how they choose to resist on the ground. It's their business and no one else's. And that's the bottom line. So, yeah, the progressives in Congress, the handful of them that every once in a while get a little pang of guilt, every once in a while they really get an understanding, a close look at the mass slaughter of 10, 12, 13 Palestinian children whose crime is breathing air and being asleep in bed in a residential apartment at night, or someone at an UNRWA shelter, or in a homeless shelter, or someone in a hospital, and it offends them. And for that short period of time, they will go out on the floor of Congress and make speeches. But the next day, many of them, most of them, perhaps even at times all of them, are breaking bread in ways that don't support Palestinian self-determination. And if anything, as the most recent evidence shows, furthers exploitation, furthers attack, furthers apartheid, and furthers the slaughter by Israel in Palestine.
So Stanley, if it's okay, I'd just like to talk a bit more about your biography, about your life, because I find it extremely fascinating. Recently on Twitter, you wrote that, quote, my parents were Orthodox Jews, born long before Israel was hatched. As teens, they raised money for Zionism. My father, a Cohen who spoke fluent German and Yiddish, helped liberate concentration camps in World War II. They lost family in the Holocaust. Both grew disgusted by Zionism and Israel. Do you think that that this also influenced your political thinking, your ideology, and how you view things in the world? And could you maybe just tell us a bit more about your family and yourself?
I grew up in a household of big mouths, my mother used to say. My mother would sit and write letters. She saw something on television. She saw something she didn't like. She would write a letter, 50 of them, 100 of them. And she once said to me, I don't care if it works or it doesn't work. I'm going to let these people know this is my position on a given issue. Whether it was Israel, whether it was about food, whether it was about drugs, whether it was about, homelessness. I grew up in a household where there was vibrant argument and exchange. Um, as a young man, as a boy, I remember my father almost never spoke about his experiences in World War II. He had been at one point seriously injured in World War II. And because he spoke Yiddish and spoke German, and was a black belt in judo, he was a staff sergeant, the perfect person for that time and place. So he was involved in the liberation of concentration camps, and only once talked about an occasion where he had gone into the basement of one of the camps, speaking Yiddish, and someone was terrified. A skeleton thought that my father was there to kill him or not, and helped take him out, brought him outside, and then moved on. So I once saw my father staring in those days at a black and white television, staring at the old documentary film footage of not just Jews, but of Russians and of communists, of members of the then, it wasn't called the LGBTQ community, gypsies, behind barbed wires. And these were things that my father saw from up close. And I remember one day as a young kid going into the living room, and he was watching and he was fixated. And I said something to him and he ignored me. He didn't hear me. He had sort of walked back into a period 15 years before and was frozen. So I grew up in a household where the combination of my parents' own experience, the loss of family in the Holocaust, my father's role in World War II, growing up in a period where U.S. imperialism, where U.S. wars in Southeast Asia were a daily exposure. I was inculcated in the notion and the belief and the responsibility to play an active role, not just in my community, but the world. So at the very early age of 16, I left home and I started college in Brooklyn, in a community of color. I lived in a black community in Brooklyn. Was involved in a group called the Fort Greene Youth Patrol, which was part of the Black Panther Party in those days. Became very much involved in the anti-war movement in terms of Vietnam and the civil rights movement. Branched off, had colleagues that were involved in the Weather Underground and other militant organizations. So I evolved always with the support of my parents, always. I came home one weekend where I had been assaulted by police officers on the Brooklyn Bridge during an anti-war demonstration with a blackened eye and a swollen lip, which had been bloodied. I came in. My mother lectured me. I came home for the weekend. She said, "Oh, I see you've been writing letters," or something joking like that. I said, "Yeah, I was writing letters, Mom. The ink ran out of it. It hurt." So I grew up in a home where it was do it. And then, from there, look, I moved on to become a Vista volunteer, which was the domestic counterpart to the Peace Corps. I lived and worked with the Winnebago, Omaha, and Santee Sioux Indian nations in the Midwest, just south of Wounded Knee, at around the same time. I became very much inculcated in the communities and involved with liberation activity there. From there, I returned and became a social worker, ran a street drug program for runaway kids that had drug problems, dropouts, and an anti-poverty agency. And I was fortunate, my adopted godfather was a very famed union organizer and president who was one of Martin Luther King's top advisors, who led the international trade union movement against apartheid South Africa, who broke the back of J.P. Stevens in the United States. And we had a very close and warm relationship. And he called me into his office one day at the anti-poverty agency. He said, "You're wasting your time." He said, "You're a great organizer, you're a great speaker, you're a profound influence in our community. We learn much and we know we've taught much to you. You need to go to law school. We're the ceiling, you need to get above it." So he said, "If you don't go, I'm going to fire you, and then you'll have to go." So I went, and I went to law school. And while there, I worked with the famed New Africa Republic lawyer, Sekou Odinga, representing Chokwe Lumumba on the Briggs case. When I came out of law school, I went to the Legal Aid Society, where I was for 7 years, 6 or 7 years, in the Criminal Defense Division, the South Bronx. Did thousands of cases, some of them very high profile. I represented Larry Davis successfully. I was one of his lawyers who was acquitted of shooting 9 police officers. And from there, I left and branched off into a full political practice with the late, great Lynn Stewart, and did a lot of work with Bill Kunstler. But getting back to my parents, I represented Musa Abu Marzuk, and that's an interesting story in and of itself because, I was very much involved in representing the Albanian Kosovian expat. I hate using that term, but expat community in the United States in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And as a result of that, I developed connections with various Muslim organizations in Washington, D.C. and other parts of the country. And I had just finished a very long case involving the squatter movement at the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And with my girlfriend, we were getting ready to go on a holiday for 3 weeks. We had a cabin on the ocean in Maine. When from nowhere, I got a phone call from someone in Washington who said, there's a case we want you to take a look at and get involved with. There's someone who has been seized at Kennedy Airport, is in custody right now. I said, look, I'm too tired. I can't do it. My girlfriend will kill me. We haven't had a moment's rest in 6 months. And so I said, well, who is it? And this person said, Musa Abu Marzuk. And I said, oh, that's nice. I said, well, who's Musa Abu Marzuk? And he said, he's the head of Hamas. Said, what? He said, yeah, he's in prison at MCC. Go see him. Will you just go see? I said, fine. I called my girlfriend. I said, well, Nara, go up to Maine. I'll meet you there. I have to do this. I'm interested. So I went to MCC and I walked into a controlled room in an area, and Musa came out, and he'll laugh if he hears this. He looks up at me, looks up, looks down, looks up, looks down. I had work boots on and jeans and a sweatshirt. I think I might have had my sweatshirt from Shakespeare that said, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. And he looked at me and said, who are you? As he stared up and down. I said, I'm a lawyer. I said, so-and-so sent me. And I had a code, which I used, so he knew so-and-so sent me. He said, I don't need a lawyer. I said, you're right. You need a dozen lawyers. And I took his case, and we spent literally thousands of hours together over the next several years. We won. We ended up negotiating his removal to Jordan, and the rest is history. But to get back to my parents, there were a number of occasions when I was supposed to see Musa and I didn't go see Musa, and he wondered where I was, because we literally would get together 4 nights a week, 3 hours a night, and talk. He's brilliant. He's a political leader and historian, an incredibly charismatic, a doctor, someone who has traveled. He was the prime person that when Hamas was expelled to the deserts of Lebanon, went to Lebanon, or to the desert area, and sort of, they claim, brought Hamas back together. He was Sheikh Ahmed Yassine's favorite young child when he was in Gaza. And when I would not show up and Musa expected me, he would, on a couple of occasions, he would call my house, my parents' house. And on several occasions, he called, and my mother answers the phone. And, I'm looking at an 80-year-old Yiddish mother, who she says, oh, hi, Musa, how are you? And the head of Hamas is having this discussion for 10 or 15 minutes with my mother. And then I'm looking, and she says, hey, Musa wants to talk to you. So, the notion that my home, my upbringing, my life helped to empower, to direct, to inspire me is correct. It's true. Yes, it became, the more complicated the cases, the more hatred the cases drew, the more it concerned my parents. But I learned at a very early young age, silence is complicity. So I when I wrote that piece in Twitter, I was thinking about my parents because, there was something that was posted once again, Zionists speaking for the world Jews. And then when world Jews say you're war criminals, you're just a white supremacist group, them rejecting world Jews as self-hating or being ignorant, and an exchange developed. But my representing Abu Marzuk was probably the launch, because before then I had done, and I still do, represented North American Indians for many years, indigenous people. I was the American lawyer who was involved in the armed standoff at Oka in Quebec, actually in Ganassadage, Mohawk territory, in which a Canadian police officer was killed in a gun battle. I was arrested along when we walked out with the other 100 men and women that were there. I was under indictment in Canada for 2 years. We won there too. So I had years before I met Abu Marzuk and before I became involved with representing Hamas, I already had a very long history as an activist, as an organizer, and as an attorney representing the despaired, the despised, and the disaffected. So it was a natural evolution for me. And having represented Abu Marzuk from there and having done well with his case, it just was a segue into the Middle East and North Africa and Africa. And that's now 25 years of nonstop work in the region.
Wow. I wanted to ask you another question about your time as a lawyer, and you sort of answered it already. Really, just brilliant. And by the way, your Twitter profile picture with Abu Shanab and Ahmed Yassin from Hamas. And yes, of course, there are lots of articles, about these so-called controversial figures that you've represented, or at least controversial in the West. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to a lawyer today because I've had a very diverse practice. I represented the PayPal 14. I've represented Anonymous for years. I've represented the IRA. I've done work for alleged members of Hezbollah. I've represented people involved in Al-Shabaab. I negotiated with ISIS to try to save the life of an American veteran. I represented AIM. I was involved in the Black Liberation Army. So I've had a diverse life. And today, I'm representing someone who is a licensed marijuana retailer in the state of Oregon, who's trying to get a license in New York State. So, and it's fine, it's legal, it's lawful. And it's interesting because he makes lollipops, which have a certain level of THC in them, and senior citizens love them. And these are people with pain and they do it. So I'm not an expert and I have no background or expertise at all in landlord-tenant, but we found a location or two. So I need to bring a lawyer in who has a background in landlord-tenant work to become involved with that issue. So I was speaking to someone today who I normally wouldn't be involved with, a lawyer very experienced. And there was another person who introduced us, and the other person said, don't Google Stanley. He spent a career representing terrorists. So I said, no, Michael, I don't represent the White House and I don't represent Wall Street. Those are the terrorists. I represent freedom fighters. I represent people that struggle. I represent the despaired, the despised, the disaffected. I represent people that are trying to lead free, dignified lives where they can determine their own future, where they can create bridges for their children and their children's children, not based upon their name, their color, their faith, or their political drive, but their position as human beings. And the picture with Ahmed Yassin, and that's with Abu Shanab. I was very close with Abu Shanab, who I met through Abu Marzuk, and Ahmed Yassin I met through the movement, and I had been to Gaza many times. And Sheikh Ahmed and I were good friends. He had a great sense of humor, and we used to joke all the time. And he had this ability where he would roll his eyes when I would say something odd. And Abu Shanab would laugh. And both Ahmed Yassin and Abu Shanab were assassinated by Israel just several weeks apart. And as far as Abu Shanab goes, his car was hit by a rocket. The very car that I had been in with him a week before was the one that was hit by a rocket. But just to show you the depth of love and connectivity and solidarity between not just myself, but people that aspire to support human rights and justice and are willing to fight for it, and Palestinians. I was in Oregon doing a case, so there's a big time difference. When the phone rang in the middle of the night, I had been in Gaza just the week before, and it was Abu Shanab's wife. And she called to break the news to me. She said, "Brother, I'm calling to let you know your brother has become a martyr." And his wife was calling to give me her condolences. And her husband had been killed just a few hours before. So, I think I know pretty much on one level or another all the leadership, the founders that are still alive and have been alive, and certainly the leadership of Hamas. I've developed a very warm, close, and I think loving relationship with them. I have nothing but respect for the leadership. I have nothing but respect for the women and men, whether they belong to Hamas, whether it's the PFLP, whether it's the whatever one's whether it's civil resistance, no matter what it is, I have nothing but absolute respect for Palestinian people on the ground and the diaspora community. The struggle to overcome statelessness over 74 years, the struggle to overcome exploitation, the struggle to overcome European colonial supremacist, racist, murderous regime, the struggle to hug your children, to give them hope in the future cannot be imagined unless you've lived it, unless you've seen it very up close and for a very long time. And I've been blessed I have. Blessed not to see it continue, but blessed for an opportunity to spend now more than a quarter century involved in whatever way that I can in the struggle for Palestinian self-determination, justice, and courage.
Yeah, I only know Dr. Bassem Naim. I interviewed him a few weeks ago. It was very nice. And, you know, it's really crazy, Stanley, what an extensive career you've had, so many rich experiences. Is it true that you've been banned from entering Egypt and Israel? Because I read that and I was kind of astonished. I was like, they actually did that?
Israel banned me about 10 years ago. It's an interesting story because when I sued Israel, I was one of the first lawyers to sue. I sued Israel in the United States 21 years ago. And I sued Israel and the United States and various weapons manufacturers and other political activists and Zionist organizations and funders. And two things, we didn't win because of sovereign immunity, qualified immunity, but two things that became fairly important in the case. Number one is we were able to convince the judge in federal court in Washington, D.C., that Palestinians had a well-founded fear of persecution, that if it became known to the Israeli government who was suing, that they were subject to potential assassination, torture, detention. So we convinced the United States federal judge to identify them in a lawsuit against Israel and the United States as John Doe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The court had their identity, but the court ruled that we had established our burden that these people had a well-founded fear of persecution or worse. That stood out. Another issue that stood out was I was having some problems at that time getting into, all of a sudden my visits into the West Bank were becoming more difficult, more complicated. And the judge ordered the Israeli attorneys, those representing Israel, that said, look, the court will take the worst possible inference by Israel's interfering with Mr. Cohen's ability to meet with his clients in the West Bank or in Gaza. So you better instruct your client, unless you can prove to the satisfaction of this court there's a security problem or he's violating law, Cohen has to be let in, and the order was issued. When the case eventually ended and the appeal as well, and a few other matters passed in around 2006, I think, so it's more than 10 years. Leah Semel, the famed Israeli lawyer, activist, human rights litigator, who represented me for a number of years. I called Leah and said, because she would always pick me up at the airport to drive me as an escort, where I would go from Ben Gurion, but I would go into East Jerusalem and stay there all the time, either with friends or at a hotel there. I wouldn't bother with the rest of Israel. I would go into the West Bank from there. And then she would also take me to Erez to go into Gaza. So I called her one day. She said, let me check. And she called me back. She said, you're banned. You can't come. She said, if you come, you know, they're not going to arrest you at this point, but they're going to turn around and kick you out. But for years, I was either under Mubarak, for years, I was able to go into Egypt, to go to Gaza through Erez, through Rafah. But what happened was in 2014, when I sued Egypt and the African Union, so I'm banned there. My understanding is from friends, even though I've been to Saudi Arabia probably a dozen times, I'm now banned there. I'm banned there. A friend of mine said, look, be thankful that you're banned in Egypt, because you could be the first person to commit suicide by drowning in the Sinai Desert if they let you in. You know, I think the UAE's probably banned me as well. There are some attorneys and some activists and some human rights persons that take the position. I'm going to make certain compromises in order to ensure that I have access to a community, to a place, to a world. I don't do it. I fight, and where it goes, it goes. In terms of Bassem is a friend of mine. He's a great man. We speak often. As I say, look, Palestinian resistance on all levels is just remarkable. From an 8-year-old kid with a mask and a rock to a 21-year-old woman with a tattoo who's thrown into a prison cell without a job, to a 70-year-old who will go out at a demonstration and duck Israeli bullets, to yes, Hamas, to yes, at times Fatah, although the PA has become basically an extension of the Zionist state for years now. But you have this merger in which I have a dear friend of mine from Gaza, one of my oldest friends. And she says, I don't support Fatah and I don't support Hamas, but I adore our resistance in all its forms, in all its permutations, because without it, we have nothing.
Absolutely. And my cousin on my mother's side is half Syrian, half Palestinian. So of course, just by virtue of being a human rights issue, an anti-colonial issue, it's always something of importance, but also on a personal level. Just as many people who are Palestinians, my cousin's grandfather was expelled from Palestine. He came to Syria as a refugee in the Nakba, and it's heartbreaking. And nevertheless, their resistance is truly remarkable.
I got to tell you, I miss Palestine. I miss Lebanon. I miss Syria. I miss Algeria. There's whole swaths of my life that between the pandemic and between the politics and what's going on has become complicated right now. So if I have to get up in the middle of the night to do a Zoom call with brothers or sisters, friends, with colleagues, with clients in the Middle East, that's not a problem. I set the alarm, I get up, I do it because I miss the community. I miss the era. I miss the Bekaa Valley. I don't even know if it's still there. My favorite ice cream shop in the entire world was in Damascus, in that downstairs cellar where you would go down and you would make your ice cream on the table.
Is that Umayya or Bakdash? Because those are the two most famous ones in Damascus.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's been years, but I have many friends and clients over the years in Syria and also in Lebanon. I've been very blessed. I have had an opportunity over a long life to go to places, to be with people, to develop friends and mentors and loves that are rare opportunities. And if it were to end tomorrow, I'll let it end with a smile on my face, because I know at the end of the day, the essence of life to me is to give more than you take. And I'd like to think that over the course of now a half a century, beginning as a 16-year-old, as a kid, fighting against the colonial, the anti-war movement against Vietnam, a colonial adventure that went on forever. And here we are years later, where it's an honor, where I'm fighting in the African Union over an issue. I have a piece coming out, the op-ed you referred to is coming out tomorrow in Al-Quds in Arabic in Jerusalem. And so I've been truly blessed to go to places, to be with people, to play a role, to learn about a world that has been misrepresented for so long. We in the West, you hear Middle East, you think of Lawrence of Arabia. Well, it really is Lawrence of Arabia. It was. When you take a look at the Gulf, it was crafted by British colonial intervention. So it's been good. It's been I truly have people I love from the region. On the other hand, I've got people I love from the IRA. And people that were Sandinistas in Latin America, and people from the Indian movement. We have a very short journey in this world. And to be silent is to be complicit. And if you're blessed with an opportunity to, in some way, even a small way, to help to improve it, to sculpt it, to make a difference, no matter what or where or how, you have to do it. And that's my message to young women and men today. I had someone today who was very depressed, a young woman, over events on the ground somewhere. And I said, I'm optimistic. I said, I've been, throwing bricks of one sort or another for half a century. And I am telling the young women and the young men of the world today, the future is bright. You are now tackling issues of climate and tackling issues of race and religion and bias and colonialism that forever have been silenced. There's been no action. Never let the mountains get, it's funny. I have a saying and I don't abide by it myself. Someone said to me the other day, never let the mountains get too high or the valleys too low. It sounds nice, but actually I don't obey it myself at times. So to the young women and men that are out there, the world is yours. Go forth and multiply, fight the good fight. It's long. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. There will be a price to pay. It may at times be liberty. It may at times be family. It may at times end up with your life. But to sit back and to be a passive observer of unconscionable events that are unfolding around us very clearly now is more than ever, because we have the ability to see it, is a wasted journey.
Absolutely. And Stanley, you have a great Twitter account. Where can people follow you on Twitter and elsewhere to see all the brilliant work you're doing and to find out more about you?
Well, it's at Stanley Cohen Law on Twitter. My blog is Caged but Undaunted. I also have istanleycohen.org, but it's got to be updated. The guy that works on my website said, we haven't updated this in 2 years. I said, well, update it. It's been a good journey. I don't regret anything. Someone said to me, what is there that you regret? And I say nothing. And there's this famous American lawyer, famed lawyer from the mid 19th century to the early 20th century, Clarence Darrow. The book and the movie Inherit the Wind is based upon him. And when he was dying, he said three things that Darrow has said that resonates with me. Number one, when people talk about courtrooms and fighting for justice, Darrow would say courtrooms are not buildings where opposing counsels fight for justice. They are coliseums where gladiators fight to win. That's one powerful message that Darrow said that I remember as a young man. The other two things were when he was dying. When he was dealing with the issue of, evangelical Christians. And at that time, their attempt to control the discourse and the debate and to clamp down on evolution and on Darwinism. And they're controlling this rigid, political Christian Sharia, I call it, because that offends people. And he said, the one thing, someone asked him about the evangelical opponents that he had. And he said the one thing that he found most interesting was people that lived a certain dogmatic life their entire life, that made decisions that hurt people, punished people, because they said it was compelled by their faith, spent their entire life so that they could go to be with God, to be with heaven, to get their reward. And he said, they fight like hell for that last breath, because the thought goes through their mind, what if I was wrong? And then finally, when Darrow was asked, if you had to do it all over again, what would you have done differently? And Darrow said, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't have done it at all. So when someone asked me, a journalist recently, if I had to do it all over again, what would I have done? I would have done nothing. There have been mistakes. There have been, there've been painful moments and situations. There have been victories. There have been some losses. But by and large, I don't regret anything. I think that the essence of life is to move forward, is to grow, is to be part of a world community. I have never felt constrained by the artificial boundaries of oath or of anthems or flags. On the other hand, for those people that are stateless, such as Palestinians, I understand very well pursuit of borders and oaths and flags. It's easy for me to say because I have this experience of it. But I don't feel constrained by it. I grew up in a time, a very ugly, but a very beautiful time in America, where there was battles in the streets, where we were confronting a very ugly regime and an ugly policy. It helped to inform my life and for me to develop and move ahead. And I'd like to think it's worked.
Amen. And inshallah, a long and happy life still ahead of us all. Stanley, I'm so grateful for your really kind words and message of encouragement. I really take heed of what you're saying. And I just want to thank you so much for all your insightful knowledge. You know, what a brilliant, fantastic career you've had. And not just career, but also such a rich life experiences. You know, even for me, I already knew quite a bit of this, but it's so nice hearing it from you. And I'm sure the viewers will appreciate it even more. Just a lovely chat, and I really hope we get to have you on again sometime soon.
It would be my honor. You do great work. You've got a great show. You play an invaluable role, and to whatever extent I can help to further that. In the middle of the night, give me a shout. I'm always there.